I'm James, and this is Producing Fun, a podcast about making games from a product perspective. Welcome to the first ever episode of Producing Fun. For this inaugural show, I decided to talk to my good friend Louis Downs. Louis is a manufacturer, and he's the managing director of Cma Creative Solutions Limited, a company making resin and metal models for some of the world's top games companies. There are three reasons I wanted him to be my first guest. The first is that I wanted to kick this podcast off by talking to someone from one of the less well understood roles in the games industry. To me, manufacturing is a great example of this. It's usually opaque, complex, and technical in nature. And as a result, manufacturing is often treated as a standardized black box at the end of the process of publishing a game. Which is a bit odd when you consider that the manufacturers are actually the people that turn a game into a real object that you can hold. And even odder when you consider that it's their constraints that shape what is practically possible. The second is that Louis is one of the most interesting and knowledgeable people that I have ever met in the game world. He's not just a manufacturer. He was a publisher first, working in printing and books, and then only later in games. He launched a very successful tabletop wargame called Drop Zone Commander with designer Dave Lewis, and he ran a Kickstarter campaign that raised around $1 million. His wide-ranging perspective and incredible network of contacts are just two of the reasons that I trust him so much. The last reason is that I want to treat Producing Fun like a product. And when you first launch a product, you want to test it with a small group of people that you can afford to make mistakes with. I will never know less about what it takes to make a good podcast than I do right now. And this first show, it's going to be very, very far from perfect. But that's okay. I know I can make these mistakes with Louis really easily. And I also know that with your support and feedback, I can make this show much, much better. So once you had a listen, please, please, please send me your feedback. You can reach me on Twitter @NailerJames, or simply email me, james@nailergames.com. It's time to get on with the interview. We join it just as I've asked Louis to tell me a little bit more about Drop Zone Commander and why he thinks it landed so well in market.
Miniatures war game, more like a full war game rather than a skirmish level game.
Yeah, like a tabletop war game focused around, it was the 10mm scale, focused around really the idea of deployment and fast moving combat and tactical kind of strength. So the kind of strength of the game is and always was the ability to maneuver around the table without necessarily having to remember 1,000 rules. And so the real depth of play was all around the kind of gameplay elements and the excitement of the game itself. Things like games are all about timing, and the timing for it, which I think was part of always Dave's strength and skill in the concept, was the timing of it was really suited for when it came out. So Games Workshop weren't really supporting anything of that scale in that market, having kind of recently had Epic and that, you know, that and stopped supporting that, and actually the market for it was so alive still, but there wasn't much product being created for it. So I think the mix of the scale with a very, very original but feeling like you knew bits of it style of game allowed and to be very fair, the kind of sheer quality of the designs behind the miniatures themselves led to the game finding a very, very good niche, and that then allowed it to really have quite an explosive start.
So that's really interesting. So this is a kind of point in your career then where you've got this game that you're working on, which is it's timed really nicely to market. It's kind of found this kind of audience at a point when obviously the really big player here that is just the Goliath that is Games Workshop is sort of not as focused on this area, and there's this kind of several companies that are all at the same time kind of doing absolutely not the same projects, but there's a kind of similarity in terms of a little bit in terms of market niche that's going on.
Definitely.
And then so what's next?
Well, I think what was very interesting is that Dave was the only person, or Hawk was the only company that didn't come out of Games Workshop originally. So
Oh,
like almost
interesting.
none of the people involved in it were from that background. They had only played those games, whereas a lot of the other companies who are kind of coming into that area were all ex Games Workshop senior members of staff who created those gaps years after, a few years, let's say, after leaving. So it was very interesting coming at it, I think, very fresh-faced as well, in terms of trying to do things the right way and not the way necessarily the market always expects.
So
Which I think was also
that's really interesting, because I think that maybe is worth mentioning here, which I think is something that only I kind of really started to learn quite recently, is how much the UK game space is quite dominated by ex Games Workshop people, right? I mean, for some really good reasons, because you've obviously got a lot of talent there in that company.
huge.
People want to go and do their own thing. But I find this really fascinating, because it's something that I only realized like a couple of years ago, that there is this sort of like kind of games cluster, right, in and around Nottingham, and kind of a sort of what's the right phrase to use, kind of descendancy, or a kind of like lineage of these companies that come from that, and that actually they're such a big part of that, and they're actually much bigger than the more classic domestic board game industry part of the UK.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a heritage almost, and it's very much a badge of honor. I think, you know, Games Workshop are one of the most exciting, from a business point of view, looking at them, companies that exist in the UK generally, not just I think in the sector. And I think what they've done and what they've built, building an IP as strongly as they have, and really committing to it above everything else, has been the reason why so many people love them, even if not necessarily they love every edition, because you know, varying people have varying enjoyment levels of varying versions of or any of their games. But I think the fact that people really love the worlds in which the products that Games Workshop create, and the quality at which they do it, is always the thing that sets them apart, and is a really good like target for people to try and achieve, in terms of, not in terms of size of company, but in terms of quality level. And I think that's always the thing that really is, you know, you need big companies in industries to pull people up. Not it's never about trying to compete with people who are at the same size or the same age as you, because that will never push you to go to really reach further, I think, in terms of quality of game and quality of delivery.
Yeah, I mean, that's very interesting. I mean, I think that that's an interesting perspective in terms of thinking about the role that the large company plays in that sense in the sector. That it is to some extent, it is this sometimes a bit maybe undervalued, is that it's actually basically producing a lot of talent. So kind of therefore, kind of even more unusual, as you said, that Hawk came from actually a different lineage. So obviously, presumably everyone at Hawk had kind of grown up with the Games Workshop games, but just didn't have that direct connection.
No, exactly that. And I think a lot of it as well is about appreciating that Games Workshop are the company who bring a lot of people into the industry from a consumer point of view as well. So you've got customers who only play war games at all because of Games Workshop, and there is no denying, you know, whether that's their school club systems or their, you know, stores, or their retail engagement outside of that, it is a genius and somehow ignored by the rest of the world mechanism for effectively bringing people into an industry that would otherwise maybe not ever experience war games. And so I think you cannot be, in this industry, in the war games industry specifically, you cannot be kind of assuming that it can be done without them being a key part of it.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Like, I think that's something, again, that I think about a lot in terms of how sectors work, particularly in board games, and something that I feel is not always explored enough is kind of that question of the operation of the market. And you raised something really interesting there around the fact that Games Workshop are actually recruiting players into an industry. So because they have this particular highly effective recruiting strategy that to my mind has, in the best possible way, and I mean this in the best possible way, has that kind of almost cult-like recruitment, right? Where you've got, you bring it into the stores, you incentives to bring your friends in. I remember going there as a teenager. They were very good at persuading you to get into to get the product right. But actually that is really interesting from the perspective that you've got all these new players who later can become the kind of people who would be buying, you know, miniatures games from other companies that realistically, without the resources of Games Workshop, with like their, you know, back in the 90s, they're just massive retail footprint. It's really hard to imagine how you would have scaled it. And maybe without them, do we think maybe war games would have been probably remained more historically orientated, possibly?
I think the genre of sci-fi war games was really massively impacted by the quality and the spread that Games Workshop had in the industry. You know, and that also lends itself, going back to kind of the origination of a lot of what happened back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s with the creation of the IPs and the development of them back then, as well as then the, I guess, solidifying of that and the moving into plastics and the ability to create mass market products that then, were even sold in places like Argos for a few years. When you get products like the Games Workshop starter sets being able to have a mass reach to an audience that would otherwise be picking up, a wash basin from a company like Argos, like that, it's that kind of difference of and spread of market, which I think is so fascinating about them and about how much they've achieved in a market that otherwise would maybe not have existed, I think.
That's absolutely fascinating. I think that's such an interesting question. It's definitely one that, hopefully if you'll join me again for another episode, maybe perhaps we can spend a little bit more time on going into, because the question of Games Workshop is massive. I don't think people quite realize how big it is. I think its market cap is about £4 billion. So I think by comparison to board game space, which I think more listeners will be maybe more aware of, it's about 2 to 3 times the size of Asmodee. So I think that is something which is, can't be underestimated. Okay, so if we talk a little bit about, we go back to where we were with discussing timeline, where your personal timeline, we're gradually getting closer and closer to CMA at this point.
Well, we are just about to, in fact.
We're just about to, because I know you had some really successful range of product ranges at that, and then the CMA chapter begins, and can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, so there was I guess an opportunity, which, together with kind of one of the existing directors of CMA at the time, we took over the scale model part of the company back in 2016, and that really we've been kind of growing it and developing it since. It's a real joy to work with such highly skilled, experienced people. I feel very much like every day I'm learning from people who are skilled around me, who have been doing not just war games, but also miniatures for scale models, as well as for tabletop games and board games. They've been making molds and casting miniatures for decades. Each person has got years of experience that cannot be replicated, and that goes back to the kind of the history of the company as a whole, which originated as a scale model business back in the 90s, with Dave Buttress and Dot Buttress and Chris Arnott, who were the original kind of real founders of the company itself. And their influence in terms of scale models and the influence they've had over other skills and development of other people has been huge, and is probably, you could probably track a lot of businesses off the back of what they had done in the past. Dave with his experience in metal, and Chris with his experience in resin, and then combined with CMA into a real understanding of resin as a material for creating scale models for the global market, really.
So that's very interesting. So you've almost got your own little kind of like Games Workshop type story here, right? Where you've got people who've kind of gone on to do other things. There's a kind of lineage to that as well. So maybe it'd be really good to explain a little bit more about, now that we understand where it's kind of come from, there's this opportunity to get involved in working with the very people who had been making some of the miniatures for Hawk.
Yeah.
It would be really good to explore a little bit about what CMA is and what it does.
Yeah.
Because I think for me, it's that thing again of whenever you talk to me about what you do, I'm like, well, they do some of those things as well. Like it always surprises me a little bit, right? So I think it would be really cool to understand it. If you could just give us a picture of CMA as a business and mainly what it's doing, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, okay, fantastic. So CMA Creative Solutions, as the kind of scale model part is now called, specializes in resin and metal production for really anything that is small scale, is probably the easiest way of saying it. And we work with a whole range of different businesses, and whether that's, you know, the obvious kind of board game, war game, scale model side of businesses, all the way through to marketing materials or items that are needed for kind of jewelry and things like that. So there's a whole range of different things that we create, and we do it. Then we take as a company, the formation of it was taking a master which was normally made by the client, and then effectively translating that into either a resin product or a white metal product. So pewter, you'll have heard the phrase pewter or white metal used. That's the metals that we generally cast in, as well as in the past we've cast in like zinc and misak as well, which are kind of much lighter weight materials.
So on that note, just I was stopping there for a second. So that's really interesting. So the kind of first thing that again, it's something that kind of started striking me the more we started talking about this sort of thing, is that actually, you know, I could say CMA Creative Solutions is a game part manufacturer, but actually, even you as a manufacturer in the game space, that's actually only part of the business, because there's all there's, as you said, there's scale models, and there's sort of other elements as well that are being made here that are not really to do with games at all. No.
So like kind of objects for marketing. I mean, there's almost anything that can be done once you really just apply, I guess, or have a product need for it, really. And resin and metal, between the two of them, are quite a flexible set of materials to allow you to make quite a lot of different things. I mean, we don't often make a lot of mechanical items, but there are resins that can be used for mechanical items as well, and obviously metals that can, but often they're of a much higher melting point, which is really the obstacle and the difference between a low melting point of something like a white metal and a higher melting point of something like an iron or a steel or something like that, which is often used for mechanical parts.
So you would make,
so that's the big difference.
You would make some mechanical parts, but you generally would be, most of what you're making is still, would say, in terms of trying to,
let's say, aesthetic over functional.
Aesthetic over functional. So I think this is really good for kind of pinning down a sense of, I think, again, trying to place CMA in the marketplace, thinking about it from a perspective of kind of core competency. It's more like it's that, let's see if I can describe it and if you would agree it was fair to say the core competency is a lot more about making casting very accurate, often very beautiful aesthetic objects, rather than so much sort of saying either we make just parts or we make game parts, right? That would seem to describe some of the expertise of CMA maybe a little bit better.
Well, I think it's fair to say as well that the individuals involved who are the most experienced as well have a lot of experience of, you know, creating objects for scale models which have to operate. So although they're not necessarily functional in a sense like a machine, they're not machine parts, they may well be functional for the purpose of a scale model. Like, for example, we do a lot of scale model trains and planes and buses and things like that, and a lot of those end up having motorized parts in them in order for them to actually move. So they, you know, so we have to create parts that actually exist for those markets and that work for those markets. So we have to consider weight and consider size and volume and complexity of parts, and ensuring certain things are able to be done in that way as well and made in that way. So going back to your question, yes, it is really about the aesthetic. There are elements of kind of mechanical things to consider as always as part of that process, but generally it is completely about how we about the kind of process of making good quality replications of masters that we receive.
And the way that the form that you would get a master, for example, would sometimes be a digital file, or would it just be a physical thing someone has handmade? What are the different ways that that these masters get to you?
Yeah, so we actually have them in a whole range of different ways, whether that's a 3D print from a 3D file or a 3D file in itself. Sometimes we get them as, well, often we get a lot of the models still come through as handmade masters. So that could be made out of plasticard or made out of, a sculpting material like green stuff, or other sculpting kind of materials that are constantly evolving as materials themselves. Sometimes we get hand lathed brass masters. We get all sorts of things. So there's not really a fixed one route that we get things, and that the understanding of those materials is as important as the understanding of how to mold those materials, or how to mold anything, because it's about knowing what that material will do, and not just about what the what the end thing needs to be.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I guess that's an entire aspect of it that people probably don't often think of, which is exactly that, right? It's the you have this. If you can get a material in or a master rather, in as varied a format as here's a 3D file or here's a brass model, then I can imagine that's another part of the process, right? That's a bit more complex to actually before you even get to the making of molds.
Yeah. Well, and we've molded potatoes before as live potatoes. So like, and our casters and mold makers have had a lot of experience of molding all sorts of other things, including a fresh fish and all sorts of other things. Yeah. I say fresh, not alive, but fresh as in freshly caught, obviously.
I'm pretty sure this will be a surprise to some people that their resin model manufacturer is also making molds based on fresh fish.
Yeah, in the past.
Yes, I'm guessing that's not the most popular format. I don't know. Maybe there's a
not the most common. Not the most common and not the most popular, no.
Or at least maybe probably more likely it would be a sort of miniatures game Kickstarter exclusive stretch goal where you get a model that's been made based on a live fish, something like that, or at least a fresh one anyway.
A penguin based fishing game, I think.
Oh, Simon, look out! We got some new ideas here for some things that we can do with this. So that's really interesting. So if we talk a little bit about, I guess, if we zero in a little bit more, I guess, on games and then how CMA fits in that, because it's very clear that actually what's really interesting is that you're already looking at the kind of multiple markets you're servicing. And actually, I guess before we move on to that, would you say that's actually fairly typical of quite a few manufacturers, or is that more of a unique CMA thing?
I think it's what's quite interesting in the resin and metal scale model market is that generally the manufacturers generally try and focus on one specific area like metal, and then do miniatures and war games within those. And I think what we've found or tried to do more of is to give some understanding and consultation, and providing maybe a broader range of services that allows people to use us as more of a one-stop shop from both kind of board game and war game and miniatures and scale model markets. So I think we're in a lucky position to be quite a sizable business in this industry for manufacturing who are independent. There are a lot of, sizable manufacturing teams, but a lot of those are internal teams as part of a bigger company. For example, Games Workshop's team or Warlord's team or someone like that, where they've got their own manufacturing base in-house, and they're already, that they've got that kind of capability and capacity internal. But we're offering it as a service, which is at the size we are is unusual, I think, in the UK, or at least there aren't a lot of other companies that the kind of 20 odd people that we've got full time. It's not, they're not a lot of companies that have those kind of that have that kind of spread. I think.
That's quite interesting. So I mean, in those examples, obviously you've got Games Workshop, as we discussed, is massive. So
Yeah.
is it generally then that quite a lot of the other companies are quite a lot smaller then? Is that quite typical of that space?
Yeah, so a lot of the manufacturers, a handful of people, especially, and they'll focus like on the resin or on the metal, and then they'll work with other people who will focus on some of the other areas. So they almost form a collaborative approach of producing things often. There are other companies both in the UK and abroad that do offer a very high quality level of kind of service, but there aren't a lot, I think, even worldwide. That are doing resonance and metal scale models and wargame miniatures, even across the world. I mean, I think that's, that you do obviously get the big companies based in China who are really manufacturing on a much larger scale, in PVC and plastic and white metal, but in resin as well. But outside of that, generally it's, UK, Europe and America who are doing the majority of the resin manufacturing and metal manufacturing for the world market, really.
Oh wow, yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting learning about how that market divides up and how spread it is in terms of, as you said, lots of those kind of small companies, and that's because it's kind of a true kind of somewhat globally, and that's quite a small number of countries that are kind of servicing everyone, I guess, because partly those are the countries where this kind of boom in models has taken place, and maybe that's something which we might yet see, I guess, in some emerging markets become more of a thing over time. So okay, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, well, I think we might also see a resurgence in the UK manufacturing side of things with the kind of interesting elements around Brexit and COVID and the effects on shipping from China and from the Far East generally, and how that's impacting, I think, or how that's going to impact manufacturing for supply to UK, Europe and America. So that's going to be a really interesting space over the next few years as well, I think.
Yeah, no, it sounds like it really will be. Well, one to watch. So if we bring it back then to working with a games company, maybe it would be nice if you could just say a little bit about, someone wants to get something made. They've designed maybe some beautiful miniatures. They've got a plan for it. They're running their big Kickstarter. They want some really gorgeous organic forms, this sort of thing. How would they go about working with a company like CMA?
So normally, it always starts with an initial conversation. I think that's the key thing, is really this is about a dialogue and about getting a product to the point where everyone in that process understands what is needed to be delivered and often by when, and an idea of what kind of quantities they might be achieved. Often we work then to have a look at the master. It's always better to actually see a master in person than to kind of guesstimate with a picture. There are some quite kind of funny stories about people showing photos of what something is, and then when it arrives it's kind of 5 times bigger, and you kind of stuck with an original estimate that you've given half a year ago or a year ago, when the even material prices have changed in that time, kind of thing as well. So I think that's where being able to visually see something and get a real feel and picture of what the actual size of the items are and their complexities, and then those elements will go to kind of affecting what the process is for manufacturing those items and the kind of timeframes. And then we'll normally work upon kind of some sort of agreement to then work to create a set of samples that those clients will then approve, and then we'll move into full production.
Okay.
And that production process can then be dependent on the time frames of the Kickstarter or whatever, so it doesn't have to all be done in advance. But there are so many different ways of working, and so many clients have different requirements for what they need. And we work with a lot of clients who produce models in time for shows, both within the scale model and the tabletop gaming markets. So that's obviously quite important, where those shows they can't move, so that's the time frame that needs to be hit, and we always do our best to kind of try and align ourselves to that requirement, really.
So that makes a lot of sense. So there's actually, you'd say, probably quite a lot of upfront work then, in terms of there's a lot more about understanding requirements really closely at the beginning.
Yeah.
You know, you're not sort of rushing into producing some prototypes. It sounds like there's quite a lot early on in the kind of process.
Yeah, I think that's something that we try and focus quite heavily on, because I think the more you understand something at the start, the more likely it is that you're aware of the issues that might come up later. I think it would be very easy to just put it straight into a production process or straight into a molding process, but unless you have an understanding of the volumes and the quantities and the frequency of order and things like that, the process by which you end up making that could be really affected. So we always try and understand that earlier on, which sometimes might delay the start, but normally speeds up the end. So, generally our lead times are a bit longer, but the delivery time of the production and the reorder times are shorter. So that's where I guess it works.
That seems to be something I've noticed a little bit in manufacturing in general, is that there is this classic maxim, isn't it? Is proper preparation prevents piss poor performance. And there seems to be this thing of like something a bit non-negotiable sometimes about manufacturing times that I've looked at in terms of different quotes and spoken to different manufacturers, because you've got people who may do things more quickly at the beginning, but that means things take longer at the end, because there is this seems to be a kind of pattern. So let's take our example then. If we keep working this example, someone's made they've got the miniatures game, or they're planning it. They've created this model. You've seen a master, and I'm guessing that master might be a 3D print, or it might be something they've sent, their own one they've sent to you, or you've printed one off. You're happy it's not like actually the size of an elephant, even though it's supposed to be the size of something that fits on a table. And you've got some idea of the project. Kind of what's the next step?
So the next step then really is we would then take that into our mold making team. So I mean I'm assuming that everyone's happy with pricing at this point, because obviously a quotation would always happen at the point where we see a product in person. So putting aside the kind of quotation process, we would then take that into mold making, and then we would normally produce some samples, and from those samples then the customer would be able to approve those to be the kind of size and color and what they really need, because we can produce for resin, we can produce in different colors as well, so we can match to color kind of requirements as is needed. And then we would then produce those in line with what the client's requirements are, and ideally in terms of within the timeframes that both they would hope for and that obviously we've estimated. And then as part of that process, every single item that we manufacture, we quality control. And that's quite a big difference, I think. Or, we've got a team of quality control people who just do that. They just quality control and pack. That's
right. Okay. So that's interesting. And so, and is that like two teams? Is that kind of like one team? Because it's interesting how you talk about those two things together.
So the quality control and packing is together, but done as two separate processes. So it's one team who are all multi-skilled in those areas, and then, but they are able to either do the packing, do the kind of quality control elements first, to ensure the quality, and then pack into, whether that's packaging for boxes or blisters, or or going to a client for them to do that side of things. It all depends on what's required, and we can, and that's where we pack kind of board games as well, and that kind of process really for batch runs and prototypes and things like that.
So that's interesting, just to pick up on that a little bit. So it's interesting from my perspective that obviously we've talked about the miniature site, that all makes sense, but as you mentioned earlier, you're trying to offer kind of wider range of services. So would it be then that let's say they've got their Kickstarter project, let's say, and you've both decided that mutually it's a project you're interested in working with each other? Is it going to be the case that you're arranging some of the other stuff for them? Because I mean, I'm really aware that so far in my manufacturing process for what I'm currently doing, I'm very focused on just working with one company. And it seems like they're clearly outsourcing to multiple other companies, but are you helping arrange other aspects of it, or they literally just come to you like CMA, you're just going to be managing the miniatures part. I'm going to go away as a publisher, as a startup publisher, and I'm going to manage everything else separately.
So it's really interesting. We get a real mix of people who are looking for people to help with the whole process, or people who know exactly what they want out of the rest and just want this thing delivered by us. So it could be that we only do the miniature, or it could be that we do the figures and the boxes, or it could be that we do, and that's, sourcing the print work. And because of my background in print, we've got a really good variety of printers that we've worked with for years. I'm going back kind of 10, 15 years of kind of mutual kind of working together, which is really good. And, we get really good kind of rates working with them and making sure that the supply is really good quality and all made in the UK, for the majority of what we kind of the partners we work with on those things. So that whether that's printing or or other kind of items, and then really it's a case of then working with our clients as to what requirements they have. So if that's us packing into blisters, as I was saying before, and having printed backing cards or whatever it is, it's really a question of how big the volume of the project is as to whether or not it's worthwhile for them and us to take on those projects to do the other things for them, or for them to be kind of finding those things separately. It's not always about cost of material, it's as much about cost of time and knowing where to get things from. And that's where I think we've got a very good, you kindly mentioned earlier about being networked, but I think it's more about, it's like we have some very good business relationships with different companies where we can source those things, and because we source in bulk, we can source those things much more cost effectively and bring it all together in one place, and then pack those items and then ship them out.
So that's I think that's really interesting from the perspective again of the helping understand a little bit more about the way that manufacturing works. It seems like it's really common, or perhaps it's a better way to flip it on its head. It's very uncommon for manufacturers to be able to do absolutely everything in-house. Like that just seems like actually it's nearly always some element of outsourcing to other providers.
Definitely. I think there aren't very many manufacturers, even in the world at all, even in China, who actually manufacture every element. So even some of the biggest factories will outsource, whether that's the, the insert trays or the card manufacturing or the dice manufacturing to specific companies who specialize in that. And I think that's really important to kind of appreciate and be honest about, that it isn't always an internal process on all those things, because if it was, that company would have to be absolutely ginormous and have a variety of highly skilled people managing each different section, and for each of those different sections to work both off their own bat and also together as a company. And I think that's a much more complex business, especially within our industry. There are companies like Cartamundi, for example, who do manage that on that kind of scale, but their volumes are massive. They print for the largest companies in the world, and they produce for the largest companies in the world, and that's where they have a lot of those manufacturing processes in-house. But even they're spread across different countries, whether that's in Ireland or in Europe or in the UK, and they've got different teams in different places. So really it's kind of, although it is one company, it's also spread across different factories that ultimately at some point probably were different companies. And they've just grown together. So I think
that's very interesting, isn't it? Like, and from the perspective of thinking about it in terms of, it's a bit of a, what's the right phrase to use? It's a bit of a chimera in some sense to think that it's, we do everything in house. I mean, and because we're not even talking here, we're just about supply of pre-made parts. Like I'm buying wooden tokens that are a standardized token. We're talking about outsourcing bits that actually are specific pieces of manufacturing that are unique to the publisher's IP, right?
Absolutely. And that's the important thing as well, is the customization approach, or the customized approach to production is really important when you're dealing with batch production, because it means you can make the whole thing unique rather than just one element. So rather than just the miniatures themselves being different, it can be the box and the paperwork inside it and the the other contents and things like that. So I think that's really, it's really important to kind of, I don't know, we try and have quite a consultative approach. You can't always with everything, with every project, but I think always where things interest you slightly, there's more of a reason to give a bit more to it and see what more can be done with it as well.
Yeah, completely. That makes a lot of sense. So okay, if we come back to then our example. So at this point, I think we've got as far as the things are being checked. You've kind of got these different quality control processes, and then I guess items are being packed, and then are they generally going? Who are they going to next? What's and how do you manage that when you do have outsourced to companies? What's it on? I mean, this may be a very basic practical question, but how do you bring all of these different bits together for the customer, who's presumably a publisher in this case?
So I think we're fortunate in that we've got quite a fairly sizable unit. We've got about 11,000 square foot here, and we're able to bring in then the materials that we outsource where that's appropriate, where that's applicable for those different projects, and then bring them together and pack those items together into the end product or into a product that we're going to send to a customer for them to pack it into their end product. So it either means, and I say customer, I mean client, obviously the publisher, because often it means that they'll then finish off the packing or or add other products into it or add that product to something else that's bigger. But we do also do fulfillment, small scale fulfillment for a number of companies where we're shipping directly to specific customers as well. We don't do that as a major part of our business, but it's something that we try and accommodate for those clients where we're manufacturing a lot of their products, because it makes sense for them to not have a separate business that those things then go on to. If that saves some money out of that process and some shipping time and things like that, then that allows you to be a bit more streamlined in terms of the process.
So that's really interesting, because I think, again, that's an interesting one to think about in terms of the shape of the industry, how I'd normally consider it. So you have a manufacturer produces, and I think the way that classically think about it, so anyone who's done any quotes for manufacturers would have done this. So then it shipped to a fulfillment warehouse. It goes through multiple warehouses in reality to docks and different things that happen, especially if it's coming from overseas. But actually, it sounds like I can see completely what you're saying. Is it actually makes a lot of sense at a certain scale for you managing the fulfillment as well, which is kind of like another interesting string to your bow as well as a manufacturer. That's like a little bit more of a varied picture than I think someone might assume.
I think it's all about scalability with things like that, and about feasibility of being able to produce and dispatch smaller quantities. I think we've been in a very fortunate place to have some very loyal clients who have trusted us to do that process as well, despite us, originally not necessarily being the most experienced at that. We're not an automated system where we've got, bleepers and barcodes. We're not an Amazon setup with automated robots. We're a very manual picked process, and I think it's quite an important part of our business to be human focused, not machine focused, which might in some people's eyes set us back, but in our eyes it actually gives us a flexibility which I think is really important, especially in an ever-changing environment.
Yeah, I'd like to talk a bit more about that, because I think the people focus on this, because I think another thing that I feel like I've learned a bit going through some of this process is learning a bit more about that all of it is a bit less automated than it maybe seems from the outside, right? It's like we think about manufacturing, I think sometimes in the UK we talk a good job of being like, we're advanced in this, we do advanced manufacturing. There's some sort of description, the idea that it's all robots going around doing everything, right? But actually, it's not really like that at all, is it? You said there seems to be people are very involved in the day-to-day process, right?
Absolutely. So I mean, I'll take metal casting as a good example. Every element of our process for metal casting is done by a person. So that's the making of the mold. That is then the items being placed into the mold, and then and then the mold being cut by hand, and then the metal being poured by hand into those cavities. Granted, it's by a machine, but the actual pouring process is done by a person who understands that each of those different elements that they're pouring has their own different slight variation to something else. So whether it's a bigger item or a smaller item, they need different applications and different processes. And that just comes with skill and experience. And that's, I guess, what we try and really promote is our ability to do things with the people we have.
So that's really interesting also from the perspective of thinking about this in terms of scale, because what kind of scale are we talking about here? So when you say produced by hand, what's the kind of maximum size or content scale that you tend to get up to here?
Well, for a client in 2019, for example, we produced over 320,000 miniatures in resin, to give you an idea. So for one client, and some kits that we do for scale model businesses have over 300 parts in resin, for example, and then another maybe 100 parts in metal. So, and the quantities of those might be 50s or 100s. So it's in terms of parts and in terms of miniatures, there's quite a lot that can be done in both metal and resin. We have some customers who are almost completely metal focused for their figures, for their scale models. And, we produce thousands of miniatures a year for those companies without any problem at all. And that's I would say we're modest in size. So you could produce a lot of scale models with an even bigger team of people.
Right. Yeah. So that
even through a very manual process.
That's quite surprising. I think it's interesting to think about it from that perspective, because if we're talking, the scale of, in a year you're knocking out 320,000 models for one client. I think a lot of people would perhaps assume that it would be impossible to scale that, but actually that's the normal aspect of the way it's done, right? Is with quite a lot of hand tooling. It's not just like I don't know, you can take a master, because I think it could be easy to assume this, right? You take a master and then you basically dump it in some molten rubber, and then you've got your mold right after it's dried. Your laugh, your incredulity at that, I think, is itself kind of shows of how different it is. Because
I guess,
if you could say a little bit about what you can talk about, would be interesting about, like, why might it be that why doesn't it work like that? Why can't I just make a mold with a fancy mold machine and we're done?
I'm going to say that you actually can. But the subtleties are that those items won't necessarily come out how you want them to. And so it's the experience of people that allow for the differences of averages. So, like, let's say an average miniature can be done like that, but unless the miniature is designed perfectly to suit that process, the process won't best reflect how that miniature can be manufactured. And therefore your average approach to something, or your automated approach to something, won't allow you to create that item perfectly. And I think for us, we refine and perfect processes that allow us to be able to produce high volumes at high quantity, or low volumes at high quantity, at high quality. And that's I think the difference. I can't go into too much detail because a lot of our processes are quite specific to us as a company, and also I think out of respect to a lot of other companies that specializes in their processes as well. It is a very skilled, learned through lots of years of experience process. And I think there should be, and as there would be in a builder building a house, there's respect and in that experience that I think is really important.
Yeah, completely. No, that makes tremendous amount of sense. So to pick up on something there, which I think would maybe good to go through, would be you said that the miniature has to be designed for the process. Now, this is something I feel like we've talked a little bit about Magnate and before, and it's been quite a learning curve for me. It would be given that, right? So can you give me an example of, like, if you can, of of how these two things come together. That again, I think people probably think in a very digital world are very much like highly commoditized. It's like it's a 3D model, you print it out, boom. 3D printing is often seen as this like super simplistic, oh, it's all 3D printing now kind of thing, right? And I think it would be really interesting to understand that as an example, and just an example of that.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, I'll use the example of Magnate, if you don't mind, James, as some of the, like one of the buildings
you go for it. You go for it. I'm very happy that you use Magnate as an example.
And also the difference between the different types of production and what it's for. Because when you initially showed me the buildings as they were, very well designed, but not necessarily perfect for production for the purpose of resin. So it could be, so part of that is about, well, maybe there's some undercuts that are a bit too much that will reduce the mold life.
What's an undercut?
So an undercut is an area that kind of overhangs that will mean that when you draw an item out of a mold, it will pull on the mold.
Right.
So that often means that then your mold life will either be less or non-existent at all. And that can often mean lead to either breakages in the production process or the mold deteriorating very quickly, and imperfections then in the castings, which is always something that is really important to consider, both in the mold making process and also preferably in the design process. So that's where then it's about, right, how do we make that, how do you refine that model to be better suited for firstly batch production, but then also injection molded or kind of a PVC approach, which will then be about material use, because that's really where you get the savings in that kind of process, because it's much more automated once you've got the setup ready. You really want to, how can you make that product even more efficient? And that's then about kind of thinning the walls to a certain point, making sure there's not actually too much body of material that you get sinks in it, which are where there's too much material applied in it. The pressure that's applied into it maybe doesn't form enough material in that location, so that you get a slight sink in the material. Sometimes you see it on sprues where there's not enough plastic, and you'll see a sink in an item, for example, or a bit of sprue.
Yeah.
So it's like a dip, and that's a whole mixture of different things. But in PVC, for example, you can get it where you haven't either got enough substance to an area or too much material in an area, and that can affect obviously the quality of it. And then you've also got to consider whether that item is suitable then once for its actual use, so not just the manufacture but actually the product for what it's meant for. And I think that's something that often either doesn't get thought of or is the only focus, where people are focused so much on either the end product only, or not at all on the end product and only on the process.
Yeah,
and that's
interesting.
The balance of getting a really good product that works well in production and then looks good on the tabletop in whatever, whether that's for a board game or a miniature game, is that mix that will give you the best outcome, really.
Completely. No, that I mean, that suddenly when you start thinking about it, there's loads of things you're kind of triangulating there. Where, as you said, there's a question of aesthetic design, there's table space, there's material cost, there's this completely technical question around certain shapes that you mentioned, overhangs, for example, so like undercuts and things that create production problems if they're that haven't been carefully planned out, and it's also true in other materials as well as resin.
Exactly.
On that note, then, I think what would be really fun, if you'd be interested in telling me this, would be kind of if you were to pick your sort of top 3 mistakes that can be avoided, perhaps, in terms of manufacturing, that you were to advise someone today who wants to make a board game. What would be the sort of 3 first things that kind of come to mind that they could avoid?
Okay, so I think avoid is a difficult question, because to a certain extent, sometimes things that you do won't have been done by many other people, and therefore trying to find the answer to that before you approach it sometimes is difficult. But I think the first thing to do is to try and really understand materials and consider what the best material is to make an item in, and don't always be fixed on material first, because if your board game will work in a variety of different material types, then that could be the difference between it costing twice as much or half as much.
Are we
So,
talking as different as, are we talking as plastic or resin, or are we talking as different
yeah,
as resin or standees even, for example, for
yeah, or
figures?
card chips or wooden tokens or resin pieces or whatever it is. So the more you kind of think about the core of the game itself as a priority, and then what materials can be applied to those parts, then I think that that can make a big difference to your price point. There are also lots of standardizations, and I won't go into them in detail, but with printing, where it comes to numbers of cards in decks, in card decks, or when it comes to sheet sizes for printing, the more you consider those elements, the more cost effective your items will always be. Because
Interesting.
find out from the printers or the publishers you're looking to work with that we know what their standardizations are, and work within those remits if you care about making that product a kind of high street retail product in that way, because that will allow you to really make the most of the space and kind of design around the practicalities of things. It's a bit like phones generally don't work if they're bigger than people's pockets, and that's why phones I think probably stay the size they are within reason. And as a really bad example, but that kind of same thought process I think needs to be applied more sometimes to games, where people can come up with amazing ideas, but the component elements of those make the game very unfeasible to make at a certain price point.
Right. Yeah.
And then I think the third thing, which maybe isn't a challenge but is a piece of advice or guidance or something like that, is really set your level for the quality that you want to achieve, and don't compromise on that. So if you want to create a game that looks beautiful across the board, then make sure it does, and don't compromise on a piece of it because of price point only. I think trying to make sure that your game is consistent from a brand point of view, from like a values point of view, where you feel like if you pick up the token, it's got the same value as if you pick up, like a playing card or something else, that the consistency of quality is really important across it. Will make people feel like it's like that experience is across the game.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that, I don't know, maybe that's something that I really like when I'm playing, but I think it's quite important to, if you're looking to try and, I don't know, deliver something that's a bit different and of a high quality, that you do really consider every aspect of a game and not just the obvious components that could be made pretty.
Yeah, completely. No, I mean, I couldn't agree more with that. I mean, I think anyone who's kind of serious about creating a good product, that consistency of quality, I think, is so critical, because the problem is that any one part can kind of very easily let the rest down, right? I mean, I think we've all opened games where we've said, well, this bit's all good, but there is this one bit, and it kind of looms strangely large in the mind in a way that if the whole thing is consistently of one quality, even if it's like not quite as impressive, it will somehow hold together more. The consistency is really critical. So oh, that's really great. Well, I think well, thank you very much for those kind of tips on thinking about materials, about consistency, and also about considering standardization. Certainly that's something I've found really useful. So that's kind of really interesting. I want to make sure we've got time to go through today some listener questions. So I put out the call on Twitter and a couple other places for people to ask you any questions that they would find really interesting to find about manufacturing process. And they came back with several kind of really interesting, and I thought surprisingly, really getting into some really kind of specifics here about manufacturing that I think seem really interesting. So if you're okay to answer those questions, the first one I'd like to ask you is from Tom, who asked, do you use FSC certified material? And if so, do you make it clear to your customers or clients, I guess, in this case, as you'd probably use that language?
Okay. So that one's, it's not a difficult question to answer, but it's fair to say that almost all of our printing that we do through our various printing companies that we work with is FSC certified. Now, it does depend on the type of item it is, because certain material types can't be FSC certified because of the fact of what they've got in them and their composition, and also the volumes, and there's some other things around that as well that I'm not completely up to date on in terms of the ramifications of it. But like probably 9 out of 10 of everything that we do is definitely FSC certified. And all the printers, for example, all of our boxes, and all of our inserts, and a lot of our flat work, all our internal stationery, all of that is FSC certified. So now it's interesting when you said about letting our customers know. I think what's really important sometimes, and it's a battle, it's something I battle with personally, the kind of recyclability, reusability, sustainability of products that are used in our processes. But I think it's really important that also we make sure that the product works from a retail point of view as a priority, as well as balancing and making sure that the suppliers we work with are as responsible as possible for the materials that they use.
So it'd be fair to say that so FSC is, which I probably should have said, is a standard for sustainable forestry, right? So you know that they're from sustainable forests rather than those who are just being chopped down to crap and then never regrowing. So, but your point is that I guess that it's part of a kind of broader question of environmental responsibility.
Yeah, and I think one of those aspects for us is that we recommend often that our customers consider using a paper insert or a card insert on some of the print runs that we do, rather than using a plastic insert. So it's not always viable, but on things like miniatures games, where those miniatures are packed into retail packaging, we very much are on the lines of, should we actually, it works well using a cardboard insert instead of a plastic insert. And that in its own right is something that I think we think is important and still does as good a job. And I think the cost efficiency often is there as well. So there's a saving and an environmental positive impact, and the fact that it works well as a presentable item still.
Yeah, it's a triple win, right?
Triple win in theory.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So if we the next question I had was from I think Ben, who asked this question, which is, how do you justify where the thresholds are for volume discounts, and how much room do you leave for negotiation? So I guess at this point you've got to be careful not to expose all of your clever negotiation tactics that I know you use all the time, even with me. But it would be interesting, I guess, to get a kind of general answer to understand this one a little bit.
Yeah.
Again, the inside world of how these kind of big manufacturing deals tend to work.
Well, okay, so I guess, it's probably best starting with the fact that we've kind of created a calculator tool which takes into account kind of lots of permutations and allows us to calculate what the pricing should be on elements of production, taking into account our overheads of the business as well. And obviously all those things come together to give us a optimum price that we should be charging for anything that's based around our resin and metal production processes. And ultimately, because we can work from small scale to kind of larger volumes, it's important for us also to be able to cater for that broad range of client requirements. So negotiation space is basically about how much less money the company makes, being very honest. So, I'm going to try and be as transparent as possible, I guess, on that front, because it isn't about us trying to make more. It's about how much less as a company we can afford to make because of a product or a process or a relationship. So really then it's not about leaving specific negotiation room. It's about, how much risk maybe the project has and how likely it is that we would encounter kind of significant issues or problems, and kind of having awareness of that in advance, and time frames, and there's lots of aspects that then we have to consider as to whether or not we can, offer any kind of discount on certain things. Now, there are discounts of efficiencies anyway, because if you're producing 1,000 of something, the process of packing 1,000 and producing 1,000 becomes more streamlined, because you're not having to have the process of changing molds and changing people and changing, like showing a different way of doing certain packing elements and things like that. So you can streamline those elements, and because of that, there is a time saving that is passed on. But there's no kind of specific price breaks on volumes, because that's not generally how production for resin and metal work, really. So it's a very strange one. I guess there are so many factors when it comes into pricing, and often they're all estimates as well until a project is really completed. So even if you're quoted on something and that's the actual price that you pay, the likelihood is it's not actually 100% known that that's going to be the price. So it will actually only be afterwards that you'll be able to break that back down and make sure that that price is accurate against the price that's being charged as a manufacturer. So you learn from previous projects on a constantly kind of moving through process. Some people, some companies will have their processes very, very firmly locked down, and they'll have learned that because they've done 10,000 projects, and we probably have. But the thing for us is that every single project is quite different, because I want 53 of those, I want 120, I want 5,000, I want 200, and every single product is different. So trying to form an exact option is difficult, and knowing therefore where the thresholds are for volume discounts is difficult, and the negotiation space is kind of not really a specific thing, except for just a gut feeling on certain elements and certain factors and the risks involved in whether or not that product can be discounted slightly more than it would otherwise be through any kind of volume discount, maybe. After having done it, I guess, for over 30 years as a company, there are some good kind of benchmarks in place, which is what we tried to continue.
Yeah. It seems it makes a lot of sense, because it seems like when we talked about how incredibly individual all of this is, like it makes a tremendous amount of sense. So our last question this week is from Mike, and he was kind of asking, I'm going to paraphrase this one slightly. He was asking a little bit about print runs, because obviously you've been involved on the publishing side. You know quite a lot about, a huge amount of that. You've been very helpful to me around different things around Kickstarter. So he said, let's say you've got 900 backers. When you're printing something, how do you decide how much overage that you're going to do? Like, I mean, presumably you're not going to print, right? No one actually prints exactly the number for the backers, unless you're making a highly exclusive product that will never see the light of day again. And even then, you're going to want some overage, presumably for practical reasons. Would be good to know a little bit more about, I guess, the thinking, what people should be considering behind that.
Yeah. So I think, there's almost two sides of that question. One is kind of how many as a publisher should one allow for? And then the other is how many is the manufacturer. Right.
Yeah.
So I think the publisher question is probably more important in a way, because the manufacturer will always have their way of making sure that either they deliver the amount you need, or that they deliver the amount that or that you only get charged for the amount you receive. So it could be that different manufacturers work where they've got a threshold. So often you'll see a plus or minus 5% or a plus or minus 10% on final delivery numbers. Now, if you need to receive 10,000 copies of something, you might need to allow for the fact that they could be short by 5%. And therefore, you might need to order actually 105% of what you actually need in order to guarantee that you'll get 100% of what you need. That depends on each different manufacturer and print process and things like that. And generally those things are, because of the processes that are involved in printing, where the volumes might differ because of the color, the colors being applied to print, or the cutting being applied to the print, or whatever the processes are, that there will always be some wastage in that process for things like print. Now, when it comes to manufacturing, from our point of view, because we're very because we work with a lot of people to produce things of very small quantity and also very large quantity, having the volumes that, being quite close to the volumes is something that we've got better and better at over the years. So if someone wants, 500 or something, we'll generally not overproduce that. We'll produce up to that, and as it starts to get close to the top, to the final numbers, we'll get a very clear idea of how many more we need. And then it's just a question of whether we provide overs to allow for any odd breakages or anything like that happen, or anything like that. That's internal. Now, external is a whole nother thing, because really that's a question of how many you actually want to sell, or how many is actually needed. And then really it's a question of, well, if your budget covers you to produce, let's say 1,500, your backer quantity is 900, let's say, as a random example, then where do you draw the line of quantities that allow you to have some production to carry on selling after the Kickstarter?
Right. Yeah.
Or so it's not just for the Kickstarter itself, unless it's a very limited thing to Kickstarter only, but it's also about what happens after that. What happens to, do you want to have some product that you then sell, after that straight away, or do you use that money to generate, a kind of interest and then see how that goes and then do another full print run? But often a full print run will be more expensive than if you did it in the same, print run as the first print run, the volumes.
Well, presumably because of all the setup costs and different elements of that, right? That make it something make it expensive. Okay.
Exactly. And then one other element, one other tiny element that I guess is if, for example, you wanted to order 2,000, but you didn't need 2,000, let's say you needed 1,000 of something, it's always worth bearing in mind that you might need some for replacements and for sending out to review,
right?
And things like that.
Yeah.
You'll never sell as an actual product. So what I would always recommend as well is, if you've got, let's say, put aside 100 of those in your mind that are going to be either used for promotion, display, whatever it is, something else, replacements, and effectively leaving you with 1,900 out of that 2,000, let's say, that then you cost your whole project based on selling 1,900. Don't cost it on based on selling 2,000. And that way you can work out what your real unit price is, what your real cost is, and have those 100 that are there as backup and as promotional things. And your cost is already covered by the 1,900 that you've got to sell.
Yeah. That makes tremendous amount of sense. I think that's a really easy thing to forget, that you need these copies for promotion, and of course there's going to be breakages, there's going to be, I guess, and crucially there's going to be replacements of things lost in post, right? So there's you need to factor all of these things before one just considers that. Okay, great. That's really useful. Well, I think we're pretty close to kind of wrapping up now, I think. I really, really, really appreciate you talking to me today. It's been really, really great. Before we wrap up, I guess I have kind of one question for you, which is, if you had to leave anyone involved in trying to produce a game one piece of advice as a manufacturer, if there's only one that you could pick and say, look at this, just bear this one in mind, what would it be?
That's such a hard question.
I know, it's evil, isn't it? I've asked you to say, Louis, take all of your experience and please reduce it for me to a soundbite.
So I think the one thing I would say always, really, I guess, is really consider your product before you go to a manufacturer in order to get it produced, and try and get as much advice from people who actually have done it before, or produce things that you're planning on producing that item in, to try and get an understanding of it. Because the more understanding you have of the things you're trying to create, I always think the better product you'll have.
That sounds like good advice indeed. Certainly, my experience is that the clearer idea you have going into a manufacturing process about exactly what you want, it tends to go much better. So I think that's something that everyone can follow. Well, thank you once again so much for talking to me. Hopefully that's been been as interesting for the listeners as it has been for me. Certainly, I've learned a few more things than even we've had time to speak about before, which is really great. Loads of things I wanted to talk to you about that we didn't get a chance to discuss around broader questions about the market. So hopefully you'll have the invitation now to come back and speak again. Would be absolutely wonderful if you were prepared to do that. And thank you very much.
Absolutely, pleasure. Thank you very much.
Producing Fun is produced by Naylor Games. If you enjoyed the show, follow us on Spotify, Stitcher, or other major podcasting platforms. Remember, Producing Fun is also a product, and it thrives on feedback. So please leave a review wherever possible, or simply send me your feedback directly. You can message me on Twitter @NaylorJames, or write me an email, james@naylorgames.com. Until next time.